All right, so in this series of videos, we're going to be looking at race and what we'll call racial projects, investigating really the roots of where does racial inequality come from and how is it created in our society. So we're going to start this by investigating what race is and how it's different from ethnicity, something we often forget. Ethnocentrism is not the same thing as racism. We're going to be looking at issues around whiteness. Then looking in a separate video at how race and inequality looks today, though clearly we're very much in a moment of thinking about these issues. In the last video, we'll theorize race a bit and look at racial projects, how ideas around race are created and changed over time. So, what is race? Many of us have ideas that race has some sort of biological or genetic component. After all, it shows up in our skin, in our features, how we look. And so we think in some way it's biology, it's in our bodies, it's in our genes, it's somewhere in there. And while that's maybe common sense, the problem is that when we actually look at racial groups, African Americans, Latin Americans, white people, we don't actually have a lot of shared biology. Genes don't really help us a lot here either. You and I have almost 96 to 7% of our genes in common with chimpanzees, for example. Moreover, if you look at my very pale skin, and you might look at your own and it's not nearly so pale, that's no guarantee that we have even more or less similar genetics. You and I might have just as similar genes or more similar genes than someone who you think looks like you. Part of what we want to think about throughout history is why has there been, particularly by white ruling groups, so much effort to define a biological or genetic aspect of race? And this is something that we'll come back to in our discussion posts and in our group work together. So race isn't really biological. If we take all the people who we categorize as black or Asian or white, and we look at their biological characteristics, we can't actually find things they all have in common. And people have done this for a long time. They're tall and short, fat and thin, have all kinds of different genes. So then this begs the question, is it just an arbitrary social category? Is it just a grouping we impose on people? What makes, for example, the president? Is the president African American? Is the president black? Most people would say yes, but here he is sitting with some of his grandparents. Does that make him not black? How about this linebacker? Do we just call him black or African American? What is he? Here he is with his grandmother, or I think this is his mother, pardon me. Or the infamous Rachel Dolezal. Is Rachel Dolezal black or white, and why? If you're not familiar with Rachel Dolezal, pause this video and go look her up, because this will come up in class discussion. Many people say that no, she is not black, though she claims she is. And here's the question, why? What makes her one thing or the other? Because for many people, when they looked at her and worked with her, they assumed that she was in fact black. So what is race then? Race is a social construct. And what this means is that we as a society create it. There is not some inherent biological truth to it. It did not exist before society, and indeed, over history, the way we've defined and thought of race has changed. So it's based on an idea of shared ancestry, but largely we're grouping people according to their looks, or what we call their phenotype, as opposed to their genotype. So race is a social category, a way of grouping people, and it's inherently hierarchical. It has always been part of a white colonialist project. So often, as we'll see, whiteness is treated differently than other racial groups. Indeed, whiteness itself is often not treated as a racial grouping in quite the same way. So this is critical that race doesn't have a reality outside of a society, but it has a very real social reality. So then how is whiteness raced differently? And I want you to go pause the video again and maybe Google baby pictures or images of baby smiling or people at work. What do most of these people look like? In our society, whiteness is not raced in quite the same way as other racial groups because whiteness is often treated as the default category. If you were a video gamer, you might know this because many of the default video game characters are white, for example. Go look at the leads in most TV shows. Go look at who runs those TV shows. So whiteness is kind of the default category. It's the assumption, and whiteness often isn't called out as a racial grouping. Now, we've seen some interesting instances in which this has become the case when people talk about white culture or white heritage, usually in a kind of white supremacist context, defending whiteness in some way from the other. But as we look through history and we look through the history of Western societies in particular and increasingly the globe, whiteness hasn't been seen as a racial group that gets called out. Right? We don't talk about white CEOs or white presidents, but we do talk about black CEOs and black presidents. Well, see, this is very similar to gender categories. It's a way of othering a particular group, of calling them out and labeling them. This is often how white privilege works. Whiteness doesn't serve as a thing that gets in my way, typically. But other racial groupings typically do because they come with their own set of assumptions. Often we also find that when white people are called out on their race, they get offended by it because they're not used to being raced. An example of this in one of my previous race and ethnicity courses, I had a student who said, one of my friends, was a young white woman, she said, one of my friends got mad because I just said that lots of black people like rap or something. And she assumed I was being racist, and that's not fair. And yet, what her friend was doing, and I think quite correctly, was making the assumption that, yeah, white people will probably do something racist, something more or less racist. Even I, your beloved teacher, am completely capable of these things. And part of what people are doing is making an assumption based on her whiteness. And she's not used to that. She's used to being treated as a free individual and not having people make assumptions about her because of her race, because whiteness isn't raced the same way. So how is race different from ethnicity? So if we think about racial grouping, it's often something that's put onto us by others. Ethnicity is much more about a shared culture tied to often a lineage or an origin, though the ideas of what this actually is can change. And unlike race, it's something we often choose for ourselves. It's an identity we might adopt, as opposed to something that is ascribed or put onto us. So also often racial groups tend to kind of absorb or be much larger and flatter in some ways than ethnic groups. Right? My shorthand for this is often, is there a blank kind of food or a blank kind of restaurant? And then I usually ask my students, is there an Asian restaurant? And they say yes. And I say, have you been to a restaurant that says Asian restaurant on it? In fact, when you go to the restaurant, you see there's a Chinese restaurant, there's a Japanese restaurant, there's a Korean restaurant. So these all have shared cultures. Right? So there's Korean language, Korean values, Korean food, and it's different from Japanese food and Chinese food. They're all Asians in the American lexicon, but they're different ethnic groups. So Jewish folks are an example, particularly like Hasidic Jewish folks are an ethnic group, but they would largely be lumped into white as a racial grouping. So again, when you think about ethnicity, do they actually share a culture and a language and a set of beliefs and a way of behaving in the world? that go along with that ethnic identity, with an idea of where they come from, a way of being really Japanese. For example, many people use the phrase Mexican as a stand-in for all Latin American people or Latinx people. But I guarantee you, if you call someone from Cuba or from Puerto Rico Mexican, they will get angry at you because they themselves have rather ethnocentric ideas about what it means to be Mexican. So those are completely different cultures and societies. They don't even like each other. If you call a Japanese person Korean, they will also get mad at you. So ethnicity, and part of the reason they're getting mad at you is because they adopt those cultures. Those cultures are more meaningful and central to their identity, to who they are, and they care about them. So when we deal with inequality today, we're going to make the distinction as well between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice can be a set of ideas you have against a different group. So many people who are Puerto Rican or Cuban have the prejudiced ideas that Mexican people are lazy. Many white people also have this prejudiced idea. Right? So this is a belief about a group, in this case Mexicans. It's very problematic. In this case, we'll see it's ethnocentric. But if they don't ever actually run into someone who's Mexican, it may not even matter. Right? They don't have to actually do something to that person to hold that belief. Discrimination is differential treatment of another group, usually based on prejudiced ideas, but it doesn't always have to be, as we'll see. So discrimination is actual different treatment here, which is a little bit different. This might not seem important to you, but there are whole swaths of the middle and northeast of this country where there's a bunch of white people who are probably perfectly racist, but may never run into another person of color because they live in very white places. So racist beliefs and racist treatment are prejudiced ideas or differential treatment based on one's racial grouping. Again, that the physical group that they're lugged into or based on their physical looks. While ethnocentrism is an idea that one culture is better than your culture and your ethnic group. So white people, when they came to the US, were very ethnocentric, and they have throughout history of the colonial project believed that they were the better culture. They had the better ideas, farming practices, and they looked at the Native Americans and said, well, you're just letting their crops lie fallow for a whole year. They're not constantly being productive. That's silly and stupid of them, ha ha ha. Even though it actually was a superior method because it let the crops rot and feed the soil as it's necessary. But they believed their society and their ways of doing things to be better. That's ethnocentrism, based on ethnicity, not race.